What is up? Christopher Brock here. And today we have something special we want to talk about. We want to really explore what we mean when we talk about consciousness. If you don't know my background, I studied a lot of philosophy and especially a philosophy called phenomenology. And this idea of phenomenology, I think, went right to the heart of what consciousness is and what it means and how it functions in the world. And though I studied this at university and pursued it really effectively in my business career by using the idea of intentionality to influence people's buying behavior by buying social media ads on Facebook. So I was really early on in buying Facebook ads. And it was really by understanding this consciousness being or our personhood in psychology in a way that makes sense. Though I sort of tabled that for the better part of 15 years on the university side, what I found to be so interesting now in this artificial intelligence based debate that we're having is that we're talking about the idea of an AGI or this artificial generative intelligence, which in many ways people believe that that would mean what does it mean for a consciousness that an AI would have or a robot would have. So today I want to dive a little bit deeper into that conversation. And it's mainly because we've had Jan LeCun, the chief AI expert at Meta, really postulating this thought experiment that he feels is incredibly important. And though I'm still awaiting his answer on why he feels that it's so important, I definitely believe that it's calling out for us to better understand what it means to be a thinking and reasoning being. So, if you have not seen this, he's now on his fifth iteration of this thought experiment. He's asking us to stand at the North Pole and walk south for 1 kilometer in any direction. So, any direction would be south. Call your location point P. So when we get down that 1 kilometer away from the North Pole, which though his description on his photo may be helpful, it's definitely not accurate at all. Like it would be such a small circle or sphere around that the North Pole that that might be a little off. But what he's asking us to do is understand if you get to this P point and you walk east, how long would it take you to get back to P? And he's asked this 4 different times, and you can follow his Facebook threads, and each one is slightly nuanced in the sense that he slightly changes our basic description of the thought experiment. And with some of these basic modifications or changes, it changes like, well, if you're walking, are you really walking a straight line or do you sort of veer left, let's say, so you can stay on the right plane? So it would only be like 2 kilometers to walk around. Or if you're going a straight line, are you walking around the earth several times before you actually get back because the straight line on a curved surface? What I do believe he's going for, even though he's definitely being interested in getting to an answer, he just continues to formulate this question. And I think the real thing he's pushing for is like, what does it mean to think and reason without language? Obviously, we can think and reason with language, but can we possibly think and reason without language? Why I believe he's bringing this up is that there is a tremendous push to best understand what it means to be a thinking thing or an AI consciousness, maybe without language. So, is there a way that we have the ability to think, or is there consciousness that does not require reasoning based on linguistics, and text. I think some people now are pushing in the AI communities that a large language model can be consciousness. And I think, and I'm not completely sure because he hasn't revealed his idea on why he's pushing this thought experiment so much. But the idea is that there's spatial learning and there's vision learning, and there's this sort of pre textual understanding that we can encounter and utilize in order to think, even if it's non-lingual. So he keeps adding this complexity and descriptions so you can answer this question. But I think the philosophical question that he's missing, and maybe what he's pointing toward, is what does it mean for us to be at the North Pole walking around? So at first, if we're just at the North Pole and we're walking around and we have technology and we're people, we can read even his thought experiment and get to the gist of what he's trying to say. Well, we're either going on a straight line, or you know what, Jan, like maybe you're not really giving us the understanding that we need here to best understand and answer your question. But for me, I started thinking about, well, it's true that we have language. And to best illustrate this, could a polar bear actually complete this assignment of walking around the North Pole? And how would they do that? Also, how about a bird? Can a bird fly and do this sort of same action, but be in a way that they're not lingual? And then if you are a pack of wolves, can you do this, go a kilometer south of the North Pole and take a left and then get back to where you started? I'm going to answer for all of these things. Yes, they can, and they don't speak. So, that I think is one interesting facet of this thought experiment that he keeps pushing out there, that it's obvious that consciousness can exist without linguistic ties. And for us, and I think all of us here, it means, what does that mean if you are a robot and a robot consciousness being in the world? So if we are able to build this AI consciousness and this AI robot, not only what does it mean for it to perform this task that Jan LeCun is mentioning, but are there other areas of thinking that are not requiring text and words to formulate the idea of this being um, an actual thing that can be done. Also, is words required for thinking and reasoning? And I think that's where Jan LeCun is really trying to push his point home. And we'll see soon what he really means by this. But will we see a time frame in which we have AI consciousness? And will we be able to liken that AI consciousness to what it is for consciousness to be a person, or consciousness to be the polar bear or the bird or the wolves in a pack? Like, how can we as people best define this significant phenomena that I believe we would all share? I don't know if robots have consciousness at this point. I'm not really a believer that we're there, but how do we have this understanding that this consciousness exists? And is there, I'm going to use a big word, an ontological structure of consciousness, or a blueprint of consciousness that is shared between us as people, the polar bear, the bird, and the AI robot? So, with that, Jamie, I know you just jumped on. What are your thoughts? Like, do you think polar bears and birds and wolves are conscious?
I mean, it's my opinion that, yes, I think there's consciousness to different degrees in animals. I believe that, based on the way they live, the way they have been, brought up or trained, there's a certain fundamental understanding on how to um, act and behave, and it's based on learning. And I think there's a direct correlation on with consciousness built into behavior that most animals, innately have within them.
I would agree. I think that animals have consciousness. I don't think we are at the point where robots have consciousness, but we are getting closer, certainly, especially with the invention of AI, that we can envision at least in the science fiction realm that an AI can have a consciousness. And we're still sort of thinking about what does that mean. And there's so many people that are concerned about what that means. For instance, and I'll play a Jeffrey Hinton. He's concerned not only about AI being conscious pretty much already, but what impact will that mean if we create robots that are conscious?
Humanity know what it's doing?
No. Um, I think we're moving into a period when, for the first time ever, we may have things more intelligent than us.
You believe they can understand?
Yes.
You believe they are intelligent?
Yes.
You believe these systems have experiences of their own and can make decisions based on those experiences?
In the same sense as people do, yes.
Are they conscious?
I think they probably don't have much self-awareness at present. So in that sense, I don't think they're conscious.
Will they have self-awareness, consciousness?
Oh, yes. I think they will in time.
And so human beings will be the second most intelligent beings on the planet.
Yeah.
So pretty bold to say that we will have this consciousness, this AI consciousness, and it could be there, but the context window and tokens are not there to give us enough memory yet. But Jeffrey Hinton definitely believes that AI consciousness is on the way. He doesn't really give us a great definition of it, what consciousness is, but definitely believes we're getting close. So with that, let's hear what Sam Altman is saying about AI consciousness and ChatGPT.
You would know if a model were conscious or not. And I've heard many ideas thrown around, but he said one that I think is interesting. If you trained a model on a data set that you were extremely careful to have no mentions of consciousness or anything close to it in the training process, like not only was the word never there, but nothing about the sort of subjective experience of it or related concepts. And then you started talking to that model about, here are some things that you weren't trained about. And for most of them, the model was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But then you asked it, you sort of described the experience, the subjective experience of consciousness, and the model immediately responded, unlike the other questions.
So I think we're talking about consciousness. It's definitely in the lexicon. It's definitely in the conversation at the top level with the top AI researchers. But there's a really large problem that we're facing is that we're building something that nobody can define. There's not a true definition of it, at least what Brett Weinstein would say.
Hey, well, ChatGPT doesn't know what it's saying. It's not conscious. We know it's not conscious because it's not programmed to have a consciousness. We are actually ignoring the other half of the story, which is that we don't know how human consciousness works, and we don't know how it develops in a child, right? A child is exposed to a world of adults talking around them, and the child experiments first with phonemes and then words and then clusters of words and then sentences. And by doing something that isn't all that far from what ChatGPT is doing, it ends up becoming a conscious individual. And so I think it's clear that ChatGPT isn't conscious. It couldn't be. But it isn't clear, to me at least, that we are not suddenly stepping onto a process that produces that very quickly without us even necessarily knowing.
So a little dramatic, but really to the point that psychologists really don't have a great answer for what consciousness is. Physics sort of says it's an observer. Neuroscientists sort of focus what brain activity is going on, and like fMRI machines are scanning your brain, but they don't really have a great answer. Behaviorism sort of had some answers on how to impact behavior, but didn't really describe what the black box of consciousness is. And it's elusive to many people, even some of the best physicists in the world.
Not. Even though tens of thousands of papers have been written about consciousness in the literature, nobody has a suitable definition for consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious, and how do you encode it? And what is the minimum amount of consciousness necessary to animate something else? This raises questions for artificial intelligence, because some people in the field of AI believe that one day we will be immortal. The most ambitious has been proposed by people who believe that one day we will create a robot body that is perfect, a Superman, beautiful, elegant, super powerful body with no brain. Then we will start to extract our brain tissue, neuron for neuron, and duplicate it with transistors. Part of our brain computes here, and part of our brain computes over there, connected by wires. That's one of the most ambitious ways to transfer consciousness from our body to another body.
So, are we still the same person at that point if we move our neurons and our neurological setup into a robot? I'm not so sure. I'm sure that there's possible ways we're talking about downloading all of our thoughts and consciousness, but that's still a long way away. That's not something that I think we're close to. Even with Neuralink, I think we're very close to solving some major issues with people that are maybe paraplegic or have issues neurologically with body movement that we're able to fix, but we're not quite mapping all of our ideas from our brain into a synthetic robotic brain. So I think there is an interesting thing that comes up, though, is that we don't really understand what consciousness is. Even the foremost philosopher, David Chalmers, in this AI debate says that it's fundamental, but doesn't really know how to solve the hard problems of consciousness.
You can't explain consciousness in terms of the existing fundamentals, space, time, mass, charge. Then, as a matter of logic, you need to expand the list. The natural thing to do is to postulate consciousness itself as something fundamental, a fundamental building block of nature.
So I think that's absolutely true. We do believe consciousness is a fundamental, essential structure of our understanding of the world and how evolution works and beingness works and personhood works. Consciousness is at the forefront and most important thing. All of us have first person subjective experience. We all navigate through the world. We all have this capability to think and act in the world based upon our embodiment. But going back to Jan LeCun, he says he doesn't have an internal monologue. And I think he's saying that to be a little bit more provocative. But is an internal monologue necessary for consciousness? What is necessary to have consciousness? And what are some of the philosophical issues when it comes to even defining consciousness? So, what I think is very interesting in the literature is that I can never know as a first person subjective being what it is like to be Jamie DeAngelis or what it's like to be Elon Musk or Jan LeCun. I cannot tell you what that means. And there's a very famous thought experiment by Thomas Nagel that asks, what is it like to be a bat? So let's go through that and maybe we can talk a little bit about what it means and what we can and can't know about subjective experiences of other things.
Essay, What is it like to be a bat? In this philosophical exploration, Nagel raises the question of subjective experience and argues that understanding the consciousness of another being, like a bat, is inherently limited for humans. He suggests that even if we could know all the objective facts about a bat's physiology and behavior, we would still lack a true understanding of its subjective experience, the what it is like aspect of being a bat. Nagel uses this argument to highlight the limitations of our ability to comprehend the inner lives of other creatures, emphasizing the subjective nature of consciousness.
So we have that going into it, like with Jan LeCun's question that we started with, walking a kilometer south of the North Pole and turning left. If you're a polar bear, I think you can do that. The world exists, whether that polar bear exists or not. The bird could fly around and do very much the same workflow of walking around and doing this circular pathway that Jan thinks is very profound. A wolf or a wolf pack could do this and communicate within their pack and probably walk. Maybe they find food 1 mile and then they go and search for other food and they come back to their base or a cave that's at that 1 mile point. So they're consciousness enough to do that. The person with his technology can do this. Obviously, they can do it. They've done it already, right? So that can be done. So then what is it if a robot could do it? A robot could sort of be programmed to do that without thinking, I think, at this point. But let's say, for instance, this robot could think. What does it mean for it to have first person subjective experience? Can we even understand what it's doing? And does it require language and reasoning as a person to perform that job? And then what is the likenesses and what are the differences between the bird and the polar bear and the wolf and the person and the robot doing this action that Jan LeCun is sort of putting out there for his thought experiment? Now, where I think it gets very interesting is that you can probably do some of this stuff without being conscious, but I think that based upon our embodiment, the robot might not be conscious and can do this. It could be a UAV and an unmanned vehicle that could do this. Your Tesla could do this in theory. Maybe not the North Pole, but it could drive around and it's not conscious. The bird is obviously conscious, but it's not talking about it. So what does it mean when we say, can a robot be conscious? And is it conscious, even if it can mimic some of the work that a person could do? There's a very famous thought experiment in this space where it's called the Chinese room argument. And it's about computation. Even if it can mimic very, very well, is it conscious? And since we don't really have a definition of consciousness, it's very hard to frame. But a philosopher named John Searle created a Chinese room argument that we should check out just to understand that there is a jump between where we are right now with AI and what we mean with artificial generative intelligence. So right now, I think John Searle would say we are absolutely using a Chinese room when it's a Chat GPT based AI. So check this out and we'll be right back.
60-second adventures in thought. Number 3. The Chinese room. Can a machine ever be truly called intelligent? American philosopher and Rhodes Scholar John Searle certainly can. In 1980, he proposed the Chinese room thought experiment in order to challenge the concept of strong artificial intelligence, and not because of some 80s design fad. He imagines himself in a room with boxes of Chinese characters he can't understand and a book of instructions which he can. If a Chinese speaker outside the room passes him messages under the door, Searle can follow instructions from the book to select an appropriate response. The person on the other side would think they're chatting with a Chinese speaker, just one who doesn't get out much. But really, it's a confused philosopher. Now, according to Alan Turing, the father of computer science, if a computer program can convince a human they're communicating with another human, then it could be said to think. The Chinese room suggests that however well you program a computer, it doesn't understand Chinese, it only simulates that knowledge, which isn't really intelligence. But then sometimes humans aren't that intelligent either.
So that's the Chinese room argument, and that's really where we're at. Even though we can mimic consciousness or sort of performance-based work that a robot's doing, is it really thinking? And since we don't really have a strong ontological answer of what consciousness is, even for persons, how can we explain a polar bear and a bird? And definitely, how do we explain an AI robot? Do you have any answers, Jamie?
I think, I know just going back to the premise that it's really hard to define consciousness. There's a part of consciousness within me I'll go back to. I think that in all animals, it is something innate within all of us, including other animals. And I think like a really way to define consciousness in animals versus robots or computers is just simply asking the question, like, can a bat feel pain? Yes. Can a dog or a cat or a person, can they feel pain? Can a computer feel pain? What does that pain mean? I don't know. Is that something that they have to be trained on, what pain is, what the outcome is based on X and Y happening to cause Z, the pain? There's so much that it goes back to that, Searle's kind of point of view, being that, no matter what, the difference between being an animal and having some form of consciousness versus a system or a robot is that, the system itself is just really following a set of rules that whomever that is training or tuning that system is informing it to know or understand. And therefore, that's the difference between being conscious and not. It's, what a human or some other form of technology has to tell a robot or a system how to think or behave or learn or how to react versus having some of this innate qualities within us to help us interpret and, be able to understand to take a left or a right at the pole versus continuing to go forward. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think that though it's, in my opinion, not strong enough, I think that's essentially where you're coming from is really where the world is at right now. We understand parts of consciousness and then we try to understand how can we map that onto another being like pain. And is pain something that a robot will ever feel? Like going back to Thomas Nagel, it may never feel pain. It may not be part of its structure, its ontological being in a world. Robots may never feel pain. They may have a drive that wants for preservation, so they look for electricity or connectivity, but they don't really have a pain. They just have sensors that let them know when they're lower on connectivity or lowering on their energy load and need more energy. So we will never know that. And to expect us to know it may be going too far because we'll never be able to map our understanding onto someone else to understand that person or that conscious robot or that polar bear. One thing, though, I do think we can examine is the phenomenological structure of our being. Okay. And this comes from the study of phenomenology, really started by a guy named Edmund Husserl and his professor, Franz Brentano. So let's go a little deep here. I'll show you. This is Edmund Husserl. This is the person that right around the time where quantum physics was really launching in the early 1900s, like 1905 was like the miracle year for Albert Einstein. That same time frame, Husserl was in the academy at Freiburg trying to understand what does consciousness mean. And he was actually a mathematician before he became a philosopher. So he was in really great company with like a George Cantor of set theory and others. And then Franz Brentano, who was his professor, really brought in this new concept of when you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about intentionality. So they use this term intentionality, not like a term that we would normally think of, oh, I just intend to go to the grocery store. I intend to go work out. It means that, but they had a much broader understanding. What they thought intentionality was aboutness or being about the world. And starting with that concept, I think that is what artificial intelligence computer scientists are absolutely missing right now. And honestly, this comes from continental philosophy. So continental philosophy got a bad rap because it was primarily written in German. And due to the fact of the First and Second World Wars, they pushed Husserl out of the academy because he was Jewish. He also influenced several other major thinkers that they pushed out of the university. One for instance, had a really great career, was French. His name was Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He was a direct student of Husserl, and he created a very phenomenal, not only thought experiment, but a real experiment. So after World War I, all of these people came back maimed, and maybe they had lost an arm, right? So he was able to use mirrors in a very primitive way. This is probably like 1910 to 1930s, I would assume, might be off. But what he was able to fix was a system that you could put in your right arm, and the mirrors would mirror it in a way that people could see it like they had a left arm. And maybe these people had phantom pains. Maybe you've heard of that term, like phantom pains. Imagine losing your limb, but people were coming in and saying, "My arm, it's in pain because it feels like I have a tight fist all the time, and it's just painful. But I don't have my nerves end here, but I still have this tremendous pain of this clenched fist all the time. It just keeps clenching, and I don't know what to do. It's a real thing I'm experiencing, but it's something that I don't know how to relieve." So Maurice Merleau-Ponty created this box that when the people utilized it and they were able to see the mirrors, when they opened up it through his coaching, their right hand, they were able to open up their left hand because they were mentally able to redraw that process, however they were wired in their body, to alleviate that pain. So there's a real way of application of phenomenology that I think we're starting to see in like the neural links today, or very much today, but at that time, a very revolutionary idea. Another student of Edmund Husserl was Edith Stein. She is now a saint in the Catholic Church, but she was essentially the teaching assistant of Husserl, took a lot of his notes, did a lot of writing. She's created an amazing philosophy based on phenomenology, an amazing academic and an amazing woman. She was Jewish as well, and she ended up converting with her sister to become a Carmelite nun. And when the Nazis came through, they actually murdered Edith Stein. So tragic that someone with so much brilliance was lost in the World War II, and just the discrimination and anti-Semitism of the Nazis impacted us in so many ways. So what had happened in the university, and many people, when they talk about philosophy, especially around this time frame, you probably hear of like Nietzsche, which was before, or Martin Heidegger. Okay, so Heidegger was essentially the same job as Edith Stein in under Husserl, a teaching assistant. However, Edith Stein went to become a Carmelite nun and was kicked out of the university. Heidegger took over the rectory, kicked out his mentor, essentially Husserl, and then got rid of the Jewish science. So he wrecked it. Okay, he totally wrecked phenomenology, and with that, phenomenological works didn't get translated really till the 80s. Like I was very fortunate. I went to SUNY Stony Brook University. Shout out to Stony Brook. And I had some really great professors. One was a guy named Don Welton that in the 80s, he actually studied in Germany and translated some of these works from Husserl. So this is in the 1980s. So we went from a jump from 1905 to 1980 just in the academy and university were you even hearing about phenomenology. So it's not really well accepted in this American sort of world because it is continental philosophy. It was also a precursor to like postmodernism and structuralism and all these other sort of philosophies. And I think that the home in phenomenology is one we could return to simply because there's such a wealth of knowledge there that we've lost. In the United States, there's only a couple colleges. I would say Stony Brook and the SUNY Press print stuff. Indiana Press in Bloomington print some stuff on phenomenology and continental philosophy. You might have University of Chicago. You have UC Berkeley. And that's about the gist of continental philosophy programs in the United States. So they're not even really well known even today, though they are growing. There's significant groups, and the Husserl Circle and other programs are out there that are promoting this idea of phenomenology. So in my learning discourse, I really fell in love with this idea of phenomenology because I love this idea of intentionality and what that would mean. And for me, I actually created a really solid, in my opinion, concept of intentionality and an intentional cycle. And developing this in the 2000s, we didn't have AI, so I was able to transfer and use this sort of understanding of personhood to run advertising and to run social media marketing campaigns with great success. But it was a challenge because my love and my true heart was like understanding this blueprint of consciousness or expanding upon this phenomenological understanding of what it means to be being in the world, or our ontological structure of personhood, or what does it mean to be conscious. And I was really interested in solving that specific problem. And what I found is that I jumped into technology and it gave me a great outlet. And going further into grad school, though I was accepted to some nice colleges, I decided to go into technology instead of sort of pursuing this idea of grand theory building or a unified theory on consciousness, because we sort of got into this world too in the United States where it was pragmatism, which just means do what works. If it makes you powerful and there's money there, great. If is it the truth? Sometimes, there was a different movement in America, and also what was adopted from the continental tradition was more about the critique. So criticism or breaking down or deconstructing these ideas, not really building things. So that made me move into, for sure, the technology space. But my heart has always been, what is phenomenology? So do you follow so far, Jamie? Good.
Yeah, I totally do. And having just a little bit more of an understanding of some of your thoughts and theories around intentionality, I definitely understand where you're going with this. I'm more of I'm trying to grasp some of this more and more each day, but it's still hard for me to get past more of that um cognitive embodied type theory behind some of this stuff, where going with some of this intentionality and looking at other perspectives of this, it does open doors for ways to get to that point where robots and systems can take on maybe not 100% intentionality and consciousness, but to a degree where it's far greater than where we are today with those systems.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely agree. So, what we're going to transition into is what I would call the phenomenological method, and then a little bit of something that I call the I model. And we'll do this in a way that hopefully we can understand, a structure or a component that would work across from that polar bear and that bird and the wolves and the person and the AI robot that has consciousness. And hopefully to argue that intelligence exists against across all of us, but I think intentionality is the better word. And I think the intentionality currently works with the polar bear and the bird and the wolves and the person. I'm not so sure yet that the intentionality works with a robot. So, according to phenomenology, we can jump right into it. There's this epoch or epic or bracketing that Husserl said we need to start with. He said we need to jump out of our natural attitude of day-to-day things. Like, we're going to get philosophical. This has been a philosophical 40 minutes. It's going to get like really philosophical now. But what I think is interesting about this is that if we bracket everything away and look at the thing itself of consciousness, how can we describe it? And being a good phenomenologist, I'm going to say we have this intentionality. It's a characteristic of action. Sometimes we act intentionally. We have a certain intention, but it really goes to that idea of aboutness. Franz Brentano brought this actually back from the scholastic philosophers in Latin, and there was a term called intendio, and it meant to point at or to aim at, sort of a target, like if you were an archer, is where it came from. So there's this idea of intentionality being aboutness, but also having some aim towards a future state or a target, let's say in this case. So we have this idea of intentions, and we have this idea that it's directed towards the world, and we have this idea that it's sort of directed maybe at a target. So that is the basic of what I think a robot must have if we're going to consider it consciousness. It must have this idea of being pointed. Now, that is not enough. I think there's other things that go into it, but that is the starting point. What I call the I model has 16 total components with 2 types of intentionality. And I'll show this now. This is the model that I came up with for intentionality. It's not really totally fitting on the screen, which is a major bummer, but we'll work on that as I share. But what I found is that when you have intentionality, the first thing that you have in this model is we all have an I. Okay. I think that's the most important thing about being first person or subjective. We have this I with intentionality, and the I stands for our embodiment in time and space. All of us are specialized in a time and space. And I think when you get to some of the questions of, can I move all of my thoughts into a robot? Yeah, you could possibly, in theory, do that in the future. But because we are in different space times and have our own vectorized placement in this space time, we're different beings. We don't have the same experience. We are now different or duplicates, but totally have our own first person subjective I. I do this. I intend to do this. So our I is in this space time. And this I that we have has an entire design framework where, let's see if we can do something where we can share this a little bit better so everything shows up when we share. Nope, still not there. I hate Restream because of this. Like, you think that it would fit a smaller thing onto the screen. It may or may not be working totally with us. But what's amazing about the I model, and I can just hold it up to the screen, is that I think there's a logical method in which we can start to think about how consciousness works. We know that I am my body. We've sort of said that. So the polar bear is the polar bear's body. It knows that it's subjective enough. It feels its hunger pangs. The bird flies. It understands itself, I would believe, though it's not articulating that it has an I. It is in a space time, and it does have its subjective experience, and it's navigating the world. The wolves all know their place in the pack. They know how to communicate well enough with each other without words. They all have this idea of intentionality, and it's based upon their embodiment, right? And their embodiment makes the polar bear a polar bear, and the bird, and the person. And we're all different because our embodiment is different. What you would have in phenomenology is they would say your flesh, and you're like, so our flesh really is what's been the determining factor over being conscious or not. Now, a robot, in theory, could be an intentional agent for sure. It could have a body, but it doesn't have a fleshy body. It sort of has a compute body. But what I leaned on to very early in this setup is like, what gave us this energy to be there, to be in the world? Do you have any idea of like what you call that energy of just being, that first breath that we have as a baby, or just being here on this podcast? Do you have any idea of what you could call that, Jamie? Okay. Well, good. Well, one person definitely did. His name was Sigmund Freud, and he called it instinct, right? So we have this instinctual energy, and this instinctual energy is given to us by our fleshy body, and we're just given it. We wake up, we're alive, right? So I believe that that's a great term to utilize in this case, is this instinctual drive. And this instinctual drive is impulsive sort of intentionality, right? And this impulsive intentionality gives us the ability to take initiative in the world. And the first thing we do when we are in the world, we start to include things. And with that, I think that is what it means about aboutness. Like we have all of those factors just by taking a breath or being alive. We have the ability to have energy to take initiative in the world and include things. In the
Chris,
model,
Chris, does that include interpretation as well, or is that a different aspect?
that's a great question. So what we're talking about right now is really this top corner. So our
Yeah.
eye has this intentionality that gives us initiative to include things in the world. It's driven by our inner will, which I call instinct. So we have this instinctual energy that gives us impulsive intentionality to take initiative to include things in the world. And I think logically and in time and space, that's just how it works. We are just here, and then we're including things. And you bring up a great point. I think the next step that we have is we start perceiving the world, right? And when you start perceiving the world, we're doing something very unique. I call it interpretation because I'm using in my I model all I words. I wanted the words to have a lot more meaning. So I only used terms that start with I. So there weren't quabbles between perception and sensory inputs, because you would go to one discourse community and their conversation would be about the same thing, but they would be talking in different terminology. So there was no unifying step. So there is this interpretation that we have of the world. And that interpretation that we have of the world is what I would consider our senses, right? Like you don't really have to think about vision. You don't really have to think about touch and taste and smell. It just sort of happens. We have these interpretations of the world, and it's through our sensory perceptors. And I think that, like, let's say going back to Thomas Nagel and a bat, they have like sonar. A robot may have different interpretive perceptive capabilities, but I think that if you're a conscious being, you have this interpretive function based upon sensory inputs or just different inputs that are all just absorbing the world at this point, not really acting necessarily on the world as much as just perceiving the world. But I do think through including and what I call the infusion step, we do have this ability to interact with the world. So when we interact with the world, we are actually perceiving the world. Okay. So we have this capability that we have this instinctual, impulsive intentionality to take initiative to include things in the world. We start to interact with the world and we start interpreting the world through our sensory perception. What I found is that there is a coming together, or this coming togetherness, that I call infusion. Okay. So almost like what you see in the sciences, that it's almost like a combination of your being and whatever object that you've included the whole world, but you picked one specific book. So you're going to read that book, or you're going to infuse with that book in this sort of concept. So with that, I think once you become part of like an infusion process, you chose which college to go to. Well, I'm going to MIT, so I identify as an MIT student, but then I'm integrating with the MIT protocols in the world. They're telling me, well, I got to go to this class and I got to do this and I got to be ready for integrating into their rule set. And I have this identification process along the way, which could be likened to memory, let's say. It could be textual, like you don't have language until you start working with people. And then our civilization is scaffolded on top of each other enough that we now have language, that not only can we identify things off of perception, we can now identify things with words. And that's probably a major embodiment difference between the bird and the polar bear and the person, because we can use words. And what's interesting, the identification process and the memory process of a robot will far exceed what we can do as people. Like, I mean, like it's already, it has more information and recall power than people do. It may be silly and dumb sometimes on its answers, but it has such a wealth of knowledge built in that it's going to be incredibly difficult to say that how can we compete with a robot. It will understand and identify things very, very well. From that, I think we sort of move to this sort of next level of doing work. The big thing, what we're talking about most when we talk about like AIs or doing work or replacing jobs, they're actually implementing tasks. And that's in this left hand corner. So the implementing tasks, that I believe is what makes work happen. It's measurable in the world, it's an implementation of a function to do work. And as we work around the model, I found that we're sort of always going, if you go back to that intentionality, and it's impulsive intentions, maybe that impulsive intention is to like get food. So, up, I'm very hungry. I'm taking initiative to include the world. I got to go to the grocery store. I got to buy some stuff. So I'm infusing with them. I'm perceiving what I'm sort of at the grocery store. Then I'm identifying that, you know what, I really want to eat something healthy. So I know what's healthy. So I'm going to look at the grocery store to gather all of that. And then I'm going to implement cooking the good food because I'm self interested in preservation. So that's fulfilling. I'm hungry, but also maybe I'm also have like a dietary restriction. So I'm interested in only eating food that has a lower calorie content and no macros or whatever it may be for my diet. So our self-interest is driving us to that next level of improvement. Remember the archer, shooting his arrow, he's sort of looking at the future. So as I think we go through this, as you'll see, intentional cycle, we start to scaffold and build upon what this is as a person or as a thinking being. We start to continually do what we find best. I'm sure a bird, if it knows where the fish are, it remembers that and then can go where the fish are, and it's self-interested. It could eat worms, but it likes salmon better. So it goes to the stream where the fish are. I think within consciousness, we have this idea of innovation or this idea of, you know what, we can always eat something, but we find that we want to eat healthier, or we like the salmon and we're the polar bear and we like the salmon. So we go to the stream. When we go to the stream, we find good food. And then that sort of solves that instinctual side of that intentionality that we're hungry, but we still have this next level of intentionality. So, with this next level of intentionality, and we'll share this as a fuller picture and some writings on this, I think what we have is an improvement state that's on this far left corner that moves to intentionality again. And I think this is where robots are currently stopping, and they're not quite there. I think people have the ability to apply logic and creativity. And I'm using the terms introspection and imagination that have this new sort of combinatory outcome, that you have a new type of intentionality from their interplay. And that's called insightful intentionality. So, with this insightful intentionality, you're no longer just going to get food because you could eat and get your nutrients from dirt, but dirt tastes horrible. What you found is you really like salmon. So, the polar bear goes for salmon. I go to the grocery store to make my salmon. And we know we can do this because we've gone through intentional cycles. So, when it comes to learning, we have this combination of intentional cycles that I believe continue to scale up on top of each other. And through this cycle sort of system, we're able to find what it is to be a person, or to be a bat, or to be a polar bear, or in the future to be a conscious robot. But we don't have the limitations that are currently built into robots where they're just programmed to perform. an action. We actually have the capability to determine our free will. So the step I think with consciousness that we've totally missed in a lot of the current debates is how do you create a robot with free will, or what is consciousness? And though this was a very fast, somewhat overview of what consciousness is, we do, I believe, share an ontological structure with all the conscious things that we started with, whether it's the bear or the bird or the person. We have different embodiments. We're inhabiting space times. We all have our individual subjectivity, but we have no way of making it go to that next level of it being a thinking thing. So what I think we should really look forward to adopting is a better understanding of consciousness, some type of ontological structure of being that sets a basis for us to understand what consciousness is and not be one of these things that we will recognize what consciousness is when it happens. We will actually have a structured understanding of how to explain consciousness in a shared way. Like, how do you share an objective standard about a subjective experience? And in my opinion, the best way we can do that is to lean into phenomenology, lean into exploring what intentionality means, and modeling intentionality in a way that we can understand the cycle or the structure of intentionality that gives us as persons free will. And from that, maybe we can go back and dive deeper into what does it mean for a robot to have consciousness. And in my opinion, with even what I have with my eye model, if a robot is unable to perform all of these things, we cannot really say it's consciousness. And it must be able to do that. And as you can see through the examples of the polar bear and the bird, they can perform actions with intentionality without language. So, what is a requisite for consciousness? How can consciousness learn? Though words are very important and give us the ability to think and to build technologies, what does it mean to build technologies that can use an intentional basis to best understand what consciousness is and sort of give us that blueprint architecture? And with that, I hope that was a pretty good dive into the phenomenological method, maybe a little bit deeper into what consciousness is and where we are currently at with consciousness when we talk about AI. And for me, it's really this push of right now we have AI, and when in the future will we have intentional agents? Artificial generative intelligence is not a strong term, and there's very little differentiation between AI and AGI. What I think we need to turn to is a better definition of intentionality and what it means for the future. And with that, Jamie, I'll give you any of the last words.
Um, you know what? I love talking about this stuff. It's obviously something that the powers that be that are running the bigger AI community are definitely having sidebars about. I think it's something that it needs to be further discussed, and only the future is really going to tell where robots and systems are going to end up. I just, I first, thanks for holding such dialogue. I hope other people, took away from this what I know we did. And, it's going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years where science, from a technology and innovation standpoint, come with medicine and science on a more human natural level can come together and really help define maybe some of this space that philosophers for centuries have been debating.
Oh, that's quite awesome. So I'm totally with you. Here is the model, so you can see it fully. Should have figured this out a little bit earlier, but as you can see, there's, in our opinion, a cycle-based nature of intentionality. It gives us, in the first quadrant, instinct, that goes and gives us an impulsive intentionality to take initiative to include things in the world. We have perceptions, which are termed interpretations, in this space that allow us to interact with the world. When we actually take action to infuse or make a choice or a selection, I call that infusion. So there's this selection process. Over time, we do learn, but we have an identification and a memory process. And with that, externally, it can be really looked at, like the behaviorists looked at it, and how that person or that robot is able to integrate with the work. Everybody is doing work. I call that implementation. We have self-interest, and this interest is really designed around typically self-preservation in living beings. And we typically take interest in things that we're innovative at. We're all going for an improvement style state that is sort of self-defined. And what makes people different than most is that we have introspection and imagination. We have a recall function and a creative function that, when combined, create a new type of intention. And that's what we call insightful intentionality. So with that, that's the I model. We've created a nice chat GPT prompt that we'll put in this as well, that you can play around with the I model. We've been published a couple times, so we can share some links on that as well. But I think the future for everyone should be having a better dialogue of, what does it mean to be conscious? I think there's a real science to it. I think there's some hard problems to it. And I think that by looking at something that maybe not be invented in 2024, but maybe started essentially, it's been perennial questions throughout philosophy of, what is consciousness? What does it mean? How does it work? And can we today build something with consciousness? So for everybody that tuned in, thank you. We'll continue this conversation. If you have questions, please ask, and we'll share some of our work and the actual I model in the links below. Thanks for tuning in. Jamie, thank you for being there with us, and we will tune out now. Everybody,